My name is Diane Kaufman. I'm 66 years old, and I want to tell you something that I've been sitting with for a while now. Something I didn't expect to have to figure out. Something that honestly, I'm a little embarrassed took me as long as it did to understand clearly enough to say out loud. I don't know how to be alone. Or let me say that more precisely, because imprecision is how I avoid things I don't want to face. I didn't know how to be alone. Not really. Not in the way it turns out retirement requires. I've been on a kind of fixed schedule for the past year and a half, though in my case fixed is a polite way of saying I deliberately stopped generating. The decision was mine. The structure of my retirement was planned. The financial side of it I handled. I'd been handling financial structures for 40 years. That part didn't particularly surprise me. What surprised me was this. I am almost never in my retirement technically alone. Richard is here. Sophie is nearby with the grandchildren. Noah and Claire, who negotiate with me constantly in ways I find both exhausting and genuinely entertaining. Jonathan calls from New York. There are dinners, there are old friends, there is a calendar that has things on it. And I still manage to feel profoundly, specifically lonely. Not every day, not in a way anyone looking from the outside would have identified, but in a way that didn't have a name I liked, in a way that arrived quietly, without announcement, and sat down next to me in a room that was otherwise perfectly pleasant. Here's what I actually think was happening, and it took me longer to see it clearly than I would like to admit. I had confused being surrounded with being connected. For 35 years I was surrounded, constantly. Clients, employees, phone calls, dinners, negotiations, travel. There were people in every direction. I confused the density of that contact with actual connection. And when the density went away, when retirement cleared the calendar the way I'd always planned, I discovered that some of what I'd been calling connection was really just activity. Useful activity, important activity, meaningful in many cases, but not the thing I thought it was. That is not an easy thing to realize, especially when you've spent a long time believing you were doing it well. So that's what I want to talk about today. The specific fear, and I want to name it precisely because I think vagueness is how we avoid dealing with things we should deal with. The specific fear was this, that I would discover I had no interior life worth keeping myself company with. That sounds dramatic. I know how it sounds, but I think it's the accurate version. And I'd rather say the accurate thing than the comfortable one. When you've been in motion for decades, when you've defined yourself almost entirely through what you produce and who you lead and what you solve, there's a version of yourself that exists only in relation to all of that. The version that sits quietly in a room with no agenda, no deliverable, no one waiting for an answer. That version may be less developed than you assumed, than I assumed. I woke up one morning. Richard was playing golf. Sophie had the kids at some activity. The house was genuinely and completely quiet, and I felt it. Not dramatic loneliness, not grief, something smaller and more precise. The feeling that I was not particularly good company for myself. That if I'd been seated across from myself at a dinner, I might have found the conversation thin. I'm not going to give you a system for fixing that. I don't think there is one. What I'm going to do is tell you what I noticed, what actually shifted, and where I still don't have it fully resolved, because pretending it resolves cleanly would be dishonest, and I'm not interested in being dishonest with you just to make the ending of this feel tidy. Here's what I want you to know before I go further, because context always matters and I don't want to skip it. I built my first business in my 30s, service business, nothing glamorous to describe. I won't tell you it was exciting to explain at a dinner party, but it was interesting to run. I had one assistant and then 3 and then 12. I made decisions every day that actually mattered, not life or death, but consequential, real. The sense that your decisions carry weight, that's something you build your entire nervous system around, and you don't understand how completely you've done it until the decisions stop. I sold that business, moved into something adjacent, helping other women build what I'd already built. Consulting, some real estate, a few other ventures I don't need to enumerate here. That went on for another decade and a half. I was, by most measures that I actually trusted, very good at it. And then I stopped. Not because I had to, because I chose to. That distinction mattered a great deal to me, and I spent several years making sure I was doing it for the right reasons before I actually did it. I wanted the exit to be mine, on my terms, at the moment I'd chosen. I was not going to be pushed out of something I'd built. That would have been a different story, and not the one I was interested in telling. What I didn't fully account for, and I say this as someone who is very accustomed to accounting for things, who finds gaps in her accounting genuinely troubling, was the relationship I had with my own solitude. I remember the moment I first saw it with any clarity. I was sitting in the room I sit in when I'm recording these videos actually, late afternoon. Richard was out. I'd had a quiet day. And I realized I had been waiting, sitting in the chair and waiting, for the day to produce something, for a call, for a reason to move. I'd finished my coffee, I'd read the things I'd planned to read, and I was still just sitting there, waiting, as if the day owed me an agenda. My grandmother used to say, she came here with very little and a very specific set of opinions about how a woman should carry herself. She used to say that a woman who knows how to be still is a woman who knows herself. I thought I understood what she meant. I understood it intellectually. I'm not sure I understood it in the way that actually requires you to be still and to find out whether what's there is enough. That afternoon was the beginning of starting to find out. So here are the things I noticed, the things I've been working through, slowly, since that afternoon and many afternoons like it. I want to go through 5 of them, not because 5 is a magic number, because these are the 5 that actually change something in how I think about this. And I'd rather give you the real 5 than a tidy 10. The first thing I noticed is that solitude and loneliness are not the same experience, but they can look identical from the outside, and sometimes from the inside too, at least at first. I want to be careful here, because I think this is where people either skip over the distinction too quickly or collapse it into a phrase that sounds right, but isn't specific enough to actually use. Solitude is chosen, loneliness isn't. I've heard that. It's not wrong, it's also not sufficient. Accurate and insufficient at the same time, which is the thing I've always had trouble with slogans. What I actually experienced in those early months was that the same hour, the same Tuesday afternoon, same chair, same cup of tea, could feel like solitude or like loneliness, depending on something I couldn't immediately identify. And the variable, the thing that was flipping the switch between those two experiences, turned out not to be external. It wasn't who was home. It wasn't what was on the calendar. It wasn't even how much I'd spoken to another person that day. It was whether I had walked into that hour with intention or had simply fallen into it. When I chose to sit, when I had decided consciously and in advance, I'm going to read for an hour, or I'm going to think about something specific, or I'm going to sit and look out at the garden and not perform productivity even in my own head. It felt like solitude, quiet, fine, even pleasant. There were moments that were genuinely good. When I arrived at the same chair because everything else was done and I didn't know what to do with myself, same chair, same light, same view, it felt like loneliness, like waiting, like being left somewhere by my own life. That distinction, intention, turned out to be the entire thing. Not a technique I'd read about, not a habit I'd curated somewhere. Just the difference between walking towards something and backing away from nothing. The chair was neutral. I was the variable. I don't know if it works exactly the same way for everyone. I suspect it does, more or less. But I'm not going to claim more universality than I can actually support. The second thing I noticed is that I had outsourced a significant portion of my sense of self-worth to other people's need for me, specifically to being needed. And I hadn't noticed I'd done that until the need became optional and started to thin out. I want to say this carefully, because I'm not talking about approval. I was never particularly motivated by approval. What I mean is something slightly different and I think more honest. When you build something, you are needed, not as a feeling, literally. There are 12 people whose livelihoods connect to decisions you make. There are clients who call you because something has to be resolved, and you are the one who resolves it. There are problems that exist in the world and untangle themselves because you showed up and applied yourself to them. That's a specific kind of fuel, a specific kind of oxygen. And I didn't realize how much of my daily sense of value was running on it until it was no longer automatic. In the first year of retirement, I found myself inserting myself into situations that didn't actually require me. I'm going to say it plainly because I think dressing it up would be dishonest and slightly cowardly. I would offer opinions when none were requested. I would get involved in Sophie's decisions in ways she hadn't asked for and didn't need. I would call Jonathan and frame it as checking in, which it was partly. But what I was also doing was looking for a problem I could help solve, looking for a way to be useful, looking for oxygen. Sophie said something to me, and she said it the way she says things, which is directly and without a great deal of ceremony, which she gets from me and which I cannot in good conscience complain about. She said, "Mum, I'm not a project." I sat with that for the better part of a week. She wasn't wrong, and I knew she wasn't wrong in the first 30 seconds after she said it. But the knowing and the stopping are two genuinely different things. When your sense of purpose has been tied up for decades in being useful, in being capable, in being the person other people bring their difficult things to, learning to sit across from someone without reaching toward their problems is a specific discipline, one I hadn't needed before, one I had to build from something very close to zero. I'm still building it. I'll be precise with you about that. It's not finished. It may not be the kind of thing that finishes. The third thing I noticed, and this one I find harder to explain, though I'll try, is that I had a poor relationship with my own thoughts when they weren't pointed at something. By which I mean, I had always been very good at a certain kind of thinking. That sounds like a strange thing to say, and I'm aware of how it sounds. But I mean something specific by it. I was good at thinking in the direction of a problem, at holding complexity without flinching, at sitting with an uncertain situation and staying with it until it became less uncertain, at finding the question beneath the question that everyone else was asking. That kind of thinking, applied, directed, purposeful, I had a great deal of practice with. What I was not good at was thinking without a destination. Thinking that wasn't going anywhere in particular. Following an idea simply because it interested me, not because it would eventually become useful to someone, or resolve something, or produce something I could point to. Richard said, and this is the kind of thing he says in a very quiet voice, without looking up from what he's reading, in a way that lands regardless. He said, "You've been using your mind like a tool. That's not the same as having one." I didn't speak to him for an afternoon after that, but here's what it meant in practice, in my actual days. There were things I was curious about, genuinely curious, personally curious, not professionally curious, that I had been carrying for years in a pocket I'd mentally labeled later. Not enormous things, not dramatic bucket list items I'd been saving for some future Diane who had time for them. Small things. A period of history I'd always meant to read more carefully. A city I'd passed through twice, quickly, on my way somewhere else, and always thought I'd return to slowly. A set of questions about my mother, about who Miriam was before she was my mother, before I was old enough to ask her things that mattered, that I'd been meaning to spend some real time with, and later had arrived. And I didn't know how to take those things out of that pocket and spend real time with them without feeling slightly fraudulent. As if the right to follow your own curiosity without a professional justification for it was something that had to be earned through sufficient productivity. As if I still owed something before I was allowed to just be interested in something for no reason that produced anything. I'm only now, and we're talking 18 months in, maybe closer to 20, starting to feel like I have actual permission to be curious about something simply because I'm curious about it. The process is slower than I expected, and I expected it to be reasonably slow. So that should tell you something about the gap between expecting something intellectually and actually living it. The fourth thing, I'll say this one more directly because the complexity of it is deceptive, it's simpler than it appears at first, is that I underestimated how many of my friendships were structured around the work, and how little remained of some of them when the structure was removed. This is not an indictment of those people. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. We were all busy. Genuinely, legitimately busy with things that mattered to us. And busyness makes for a specific kind of friendship, warm, real in the moment, genuinely caring, but not quite load-bearing. The kind of friendship that functions very well when both people have their own full lives and see each other inside the overlap. When the relationship is something you dip into and out of, reliably, between things that require your full attention. That's not a lesser form of connection. It's a real one. It served everyone involved for a long time, and I'm not dismissing it. But it's not the same as the kind of friendship that holds weight when you need weight held. That tolerates your uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. That you can call not because you have news or a problem or an update, but simply because you want to hear a familiar voice and sit inside a conversation for a while without it needing to go anywhere. I had fewer of those than I'd thought. The gap between the number I believed I had and the number I could actually confirm, that gap was uncomfortable to measure. There is a woman, Carolyn. We'd known each other for maybe 15 years. We ran in many of the same circles. We had dinner a few months into my retirement. No agenda, just dinner. And I noticed within the first 20 minutes that we had always talked about work. The whole 15 years. Our entire friendship was built on the scaffolding of our respective professional lives. We shared resources. We updated each other on our respective worlds. We commiserated about common problems. We introduced each other to people who turned out to be useful. It was warm. It was real. It was 15 years of genuine regard. And without the professional scaffolding, without the updates to exchange, without the shared context that had always organized the conversation. We didn't entirely know what we were doing across the table from each other. We kept reaching for topics and finding the cupboard more bare than expected. It wasn't uncomfortable in a painful way. It was just honest in a way we hadn't been before. We parted warmly. I have real regard for her. But I drove home that evening understanding something I would have preferred not to understand quite that clearly. And the understanding, while uncomfortable in the moment, was useful in the weeks that followed, because it told me where to look and what to look for. The fifth thing is the one that surprised me most, the one I've been turning over the longest. And I've thought about how to say it without it sounding like something embroidered on a pillow that I would never in my life buy. I had to learn to be a decent host for my own inner life. I know how that sounds. Stay with me. I spent most of my adult life being very good at creating conditions for other people, good at structuring a meeting so the right things got decided without anyone feeling cornered, good at reading a room and adjusting without anyone noticing the adjustment had been made, good at being in a situation in a way that made the situation better for everyone present. That was a genuine skill. I worked at it deliberately. I was proud of it. What I had essentially no practice doing was applying any of that same attentiveness to my own internal experience. When I was anxious, I found something to do. When I was uncertain, I analyzed until the uncertainty became more manageable, or at least more organized. When I was sad, and there were things to be sad about, over 40 years of building things, there are always things to be sad about. I made a plan. I was, as Richard once said, with the particular kind of accurate affection that is very difficult to argue with directly, the worst audience for your own experience. He wasn't wrong. Learning to be alone, really alone, inside yourself, without running from what's there, without that becoming loneliness, turned out to require something I hadn't built. The ability to sit with my own experience without immediately converting it into a task, without turning what I was feeling into something that needed to be resolved before the day could proceed, without looking at what was there and deciding it was a problem that needed managing before I was allowed to move on. My grandmother, I keep coming back to her, which probably tells me something worth paying attention to, would have understood this, I think, in a way I couldn't have articulated to her while she was alive. She would have called it presence. Not a spiritual word for her, just a practical one, being actually there in the thing that is happening, rather than already thinking about what comes next. I'm not fully there. I want to be precise about that, and I don't want to write a version of myself that is further along than I actually am. But I'm further than I was, further than I thought I would be, honestly, at this point in the process. The loneliness I felt in those early months has become something else, not gone, not transformed into some kind of luminous peace I'm going to over-describe to you. Something quieter than either of those, more like solitude and less like being left somewhere, more like a room I chose to be in and less like one I couldn't figure out how to leave. That distinction for me has been worth everything it took to get there. Here's what I actually think, having gone through all of that. The retirement nobody puts in the brochure, and I'll say this from a comfortable position, a chosen life, a good chair in a good room, is the one where you discover you are a stranger to parts of yourself you thought you'd long since met. That's not a comfortable discovery. It's also not a catastrophe. It's just information. Expensive information, in time and discomfort, but useful. Some days I sit with myself and it's genuinely fine. Some days I'd rather be doing almost anything else. And I notice that now, without deciding immediately that something is wrong. That's the version of this that's actually true, not triumphant, not resolved, just ongoing, and more interesting than I expected it to be. If any of this is landing, if any of this sounds like your Tuesday afternoon, your quiet room, your version of the chair, leave a comment. I read them. I want to ask you something specific. What is the one thing about being alone in retirement you didn't expect? Not the large dramatic version, the small quiet one. The thing that arrived without announcing itself and sat down next to you before you noticed it was there. I find those more useful than the big answers, and I suspect I'm not the only one. If you want to follow up on this, I want to do one specifically about friendships at this stage, about building the kind that are actually load-bearing, and why it's a different undertaking than it was in your 30s or 40s. I have more to say about it than I realized I did. Subscribe if you'd like to see it. I'll get to it. All right. Take good care of yourselves.